They say the cruelest deaths aren't found in the wilderness or the battlefield, but at a warm hearth where you thought you were safe. Imagine walking into a stranger's home on a winter night, the smell of stew in the air, fire crackling in the grate, voices welcoming you like kin. You set down your pack, accept the bread offered, feel the warmth return to your bones. And only then do you notice the silence between the words. The glances exchanged across the table, the way the door has been bolted shut behind you. This is not just a story of murder. This is the story of a family who turned hospitality into a weapon, who learned that trust was the easiest snare, and who used their hearth not to protect life, but to harvest it. The Ridge family lived on the margins of a growing settlement, close enough for their smoke to be seen, but far enough that cries for help would never carry. To the outside world, they were poor but respectable farmers scratching a living from rough soil, churchgoers who kept to themselves. But for the desperate travelers who stepped across their threshold, the Ridge homestead became something else entirely, a slaughterhouse disguised as a home. Before we enter their story, take a moment to settle yourself. Let me know in the comments where you're re-listening from and how late it is where you are. These shadows stretch farther when we walk through them together. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the Ridge family's secret is one of the darkest we've uncovered, and what lies ahead makes most tales of frontier violence feel almost merciful. Not all monsters live in the wilderness. Some build their homes where the road bends, where the weary traveler longs for warmth, where smoke curling from a chimney looks like salvation. The cruelest deaths do not come from wolves or storms, but from the hearth of a stranger who smiles as they lock the door behind you. The Ridge family understood this better than anyone. They knew that in a land where hunger gnawed and frost bit at the bones, no bait was stronger than hospitality, a fire, a meal, a bed for the night. To pass them by was to risk freezing in the dark. To step inside was to risk never leaving again. They were not nobles in mansions or eccentrics with vast wealth. The Ridges were simple folk, or so they appeared, farmers living on the margins of a growing settlement, a family that kept to themselves. Their land wasn't rich, their fences sagged, their barn leaned, but their table was always full, their debts always paid, their children always fed. Neighbors muttered about their good fortune, but most explained it away. Luck, hard work, God's blessing. No one looked too closely. No one wanted to, because to look too closely meant asking why so many strangers vanished after stopping at their hearth. It was Eleanor Ridge who welcomed them first. She had the air of a woman, both kind and unremarkable, the sort who stirred stew with one hand and patted your arm with the other. Her voice was gentle, her smile small, her manner steady. You could not imagine cruelty in her bub. That was her gift. A gift that turned fear into trust, and trust into fatal mistake. Her husband, Matthew, was the opposite. Broad-shouldered, heavy-jawed eyes that seemed always calculating. He spoke little, He didn't need to. His presence at the table was enough to remind guests that leaving was not theirs to decide. And their eldest son, Isaac, inherited the worst of both parents, the soft voice of his mother and the brute strength of his father. To strangers, he looked like another farmhand. To those who saw him last, he was the one who barred the shutters when the stew was served. The family's method was as simple as it was horrifying. The hearth was their stage, supper was their snare. While Eleanor distracted with questions about the road and the weather, Isaac moved behind the guest, sliding the bolt on the door. Then Matthew stepped forwards, sometimes with a hammer, sometimes with rope. The fire roared, drowning out the sounds. And when the flames settled, the ridge larder was a little fuller, the ridge purse a little heavier, and the ridge orchard held another secret buried in its soil. The neighbors noticed things, of course. They always do. A peddler who left town never reached the next. A hunter who stopped at the ridges vanished into thin air. When asked, Eleanor would explain with calm certainty. The man had eaten and gone on. Perhaps he lost his way. Perhaps wolves took him. Her explanations were so ordinary, so gentle, that doubt melted like snow on hot coals. And when that failed, generosity sealed suspicion's mouth. The Ridges were quick to lend a hand, to share meat, to help mend a fence, to gift here, a coin there, a basket of bread delivered to a grieving widow who would accuse a family so helpful. But the land itself began to speak against them. Bones surfaced where the creek flooded in spring. Dogs dragged charred fragments from the ashes of the ridge hearth. Children playing in the orchard stumbled across things they should never have seen. People whispered, but whispers were as far as they dared to go. The law was weak, the settlement young, and the Ridges were not people you wanted as enemies. For years, the family thrived this way, their hearth both lure and weapon. But every trap eventually falters. Every family that feasts on strangers eventually leaves a trail too wide to ignore. And when that trail led to the ridgeline cabin one bitter winter, the settlement discovered what lay behind the Ridge's open door and smiling welcome. Before we step into that night, before we sit at their table and hear the door bolt shut, I want you to pause. Imagine yourself as the traveler, cold, hungry, lost. You see a glow in the distance, the promise of warmth. Would you walk toward it? Would you knock? Would you step inside? This is the story of those who did, and of the family who waited with fire in their hearth and knives at their side. The Ridge homestead sat on the edge of the settlement, where the packed dirt road began to dissolve into forest path. Close enough that their smoke could be seen from town, but far enough that no cry for help would ever carry. The house was plain, built of rough-hewn logs, its roof patched with moss, its barn sagging like an old man's back. To most who passed, it was unremarkable. To those who knew better, it was a place to avoid after dark. Eleanor Ridge was the first face most travelers saw. She wore plain dresses, her hair tucked beneath a bonnet, her hands always busy with dough, thread, or ladle. Her voice carried the softness of habit, the cadence of someone who had raised children and buried kin. She asked questions that seemed harmless: the road you had taken, the weather behind you, where you planned to go next. Her words lulled men into trust, into speaking too freely, into revealing that no one knew exactly where they were or when they might return. That was all Eleanor needed to know. Matthew Ridge was the figure that loomed larger than the cabin itself. His shoulders seemed too wide for his shirt, his face fixed in a frown that could freeze a man in his seat. When he spoke, it was in short, flat tones that brooked no challenge. He handled the farm work, the chopping, the hunting oar, so the neighbors thought. In truth, he handled the heavier tasks of their secret trade. A man built for labor was also a man built for killing, and Matthew had long since stopped seeing the difference. Isaac, the eldest son, was the silent shadow that tied their work together. He was not yet 20 when whispers about the family first grew, but already he moved with the assurance of someone who had rehearsed the steps 100 times. It was Isaac who barred the door when a stranger entered, Isaac who latched the shutters, Isaac who made certain the fire roared high enough to cover muffled sounds. He inherited his father's strength, but wrapped it in his mother's calm, a mixture that made him all the more dangerous. The younger Ridge children were rarely seen by strangers. Some said they were kept away from the hearth when the family worked. Others claimed they were made to watch, taught early what it meant to survive. Whatever the truth, no one doubted that the family as a whole moved like a single machine. Each had their part, and each part fit without hesitation. Their method was chilling in its simplicity. The hearth was the stage, the meal the snare. Eleanor would ladle stew into wooden bowls, offering bread and drink. While the traveler settled, Isaac slipped the bolt on the door, moved to the shutters. Matthew stood nearby, his hand on the haft of a hammer, the curve of a rope. The moment came when Eleanor would look across the table, meet her husband's eye, and give the faintest nod. Then the fire roared, the hammer fell, and the Ridge family gained another victim. Their victims rarely left traces. The bodies were disposed of with care, burned in the hearth until only bone fragments remained. Buried shallow in the orchard where the soil was already loose, or dropped into the creek where spring floods would scatter them downstream. Belongings were hidden, repurposed, or traded quietly in distant towns. The Ridge tablecloths came from a peddler's wagon. Their tools bore initials, not their own. Their pantry held spices no local merchant remembered selling. Each item was a fragment of a vanished life, woven into the fabric of the Ridge household. The settlement noticed, of course. People always notice. They whispered about travelers who never arrived, about the way the Ridge family never seemed to struggle as others did. They saw the children dressed in clothes too fine, the debts repaid too quickly, the farm that thrived despite poor soil. Yet, whenever doubt rose, Eleanor's calm explanations quenched it. She said the peddler had taken a different road. She said wolves were thick that season. She said strangers often exaggerated their plans. She said it all with such steady conviction that even those who doubted found themselves nodding along. And when words failed, gifts followed. A basket of bread left at a neighbor's door, a joint of venison given freely, a coin lent without interest. Generosity bought silence, and silence bought time. For years, the ridge hearth burned bright, each flame fueled by the lives of those who had mistaken kindness for safety. But the land itself does not lie. Bones surfaced when rains swelled the creek, white against the mud. Dogs dug at the orchard and carried back things no one wanted to see. Smoke from the chimney sometimes carried a stench not of pork or venison, but of something darker, something neighbors could not name aloud. People whispered, but whispers were not enough to stop the fire. The Ridges had turned hospitality into a system. They had learned that trust was the easiest chain to fasten, and they believed, with good reason, that no one would dare break the silence. But silence is fragile, and the hearth that lures strangers eventually lures the wrong one. Every family that feeds on strangers eventually meets the one guest who refuses to be devoured. For the Ridge family, that guest was Caleb Dawson. He came not as a wanderer, but as a brother on a mission. His younger kin, Thomas Dawson, had left home weeks earlier with a pack of furs and a promise to return with coin enough to buy new land. The last word of him came from a trader who'd seen Thomas heading toward the Ridgeline Road. After that, silence. Caleb knew his brother was no fool, no drunkard, no man to vanish without reason. When whispers reached him that Thomas had last been spotted near the Ridge farm, Caleb saddled his horse and set out with the certainty of blood, calling for blood. By the time he reached the Ridge homestead, dusk had settled over the valley. The chimney poured smoke, the fire inside glowing bright against the frost. To any other traveler, it would have looked like salvation. To Caleb, it looked like the end of a trail. He dismounted, tied his horse, and stepped toward the door. Eleanor Ridge answered with the same smile she had given to so many before. She invited him in, her voice warm, her eyes searching. Caleb noted the way her hands trembled only slightly, the flicker in her gaze when he said his brother's name. She recovered quickly, said she remembered no such man, but insisted he was welcome to supper. The table was already set, the stew already simmering. A bed waiting, if he chose to stay. Caleb entered, but he entered differently than others had. His eyes roved the room, marking details. A trunk in the corner, its leather cracked, initials carved that were not Ridge. A stain near the hearth, too dark, too deep in the wood. A child's toy carved with letters he didn't recognize. He ate the stew, but only pretended to swallow, letting the bitter taste linger on his tongue. He listened as Matthew Ridge grunted one-word answers, as Isaac moved behind him to latch the shutters. He felt the bolt slide into place on the door. And he understood. The family thought they had him trapped. In truth, he had been ready since the moment Eleanor opened the door. Beneath his coat was a knife his brother had carved for him years earlier, the handle worn smooth from use. His right hand never left it as he spoke. He asked questions, let them talk, let the silence between them widen until it was clear they were measuring him not as a guest but as meat. What happened next would be told in fragments for years to come. Some swore Caleb rose suddenly, upending the table, scattering bowls and spoons across the floor. Others said he feigned weakness, let Isaac come close before striking. Still others claimed Eleanor herself gave the signal too soon, her nod betraying the family's rhythm. However it happened, steel flashed in the firelight, voices shouted, the hearth overturned, flames licked up the walls as smoke filled the room. Caleb fought like a man who knew the only way out was through blood. By dawn, he stumbled into the settlement, his clothes torn, his face burned, carrying in his hand the one thing no whisper could dismiss. His brother's belt buckle pried from the ridge floorboards in the chaos of the fight. His voice was hoarse, his body trembling, but his words cut clear. They killed him. They've killed more. Their hearth is a grave. The settlement could no longer pretend. For years, suspicions had been smothered by Eleanor's calm words, by the family's generosity, by the absence of proof. Now proof lay in Caleb's bloodied hand. Men who had muttered quietly in taverns now shouted in anger. Women who had warned their children to stay away now demanded justice. The silence that had protected the ridges cracked wide open. A posse was gathered before nightfall, torches in hand, rifles loaded. They marched toward the ridgeline cabin as frost crunched underfoot, their breath rising like smoke in the winter air. They expected to find the family unaware, asleep, cornered. Instead, they found shutters barred, rifles ready, the cabin already fortified. The Ridges had known Caleb lived, and they knew he would return with others. The standoff that followed was seared into the memory of the settlement. Shots cracked in the night, flames rose from the cabin roof, voices screamed against the roar of fire. The Ridges fought with the desperation of wolves cornered in their den, using every plank, every shadow, every weapon at hand. But the settlement would not retreat. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many lives had vanished into that hearth. When the door finally gave way, the fire had consumed half the cabin. Smoke poured from every crack, flames licking across the rafters. The family was gone, whether into the woods, into the earth, or into the fire itself. No one could say, only ashes, bones, and silence remained. Some claimed they perished in the blaze, their bodies swallowed by the same fire that had hidden their crimes. Others swore they slipped into the forest, shadows among shadows, to start anew somewhere else, under another name, with another hearth waiting to trap the desperate. 4 years after, disappearances continued in the frontier, and whenever a traveler vanished near a lonely cabin, one phrase returned: "The Ridges are still out there." Caleb Dawson lived, but he lived with scars. His face carried burns, his hands trembled, his nights were filled with smoke and screams. He had avenged his brother, but at a cost no one could envy. And though the settlement praised him, though they swore they owed him their safety, he carried the guilt of knowing he had been one meal away from joining the orchard, the creek, the ashes in the hearth. The ridges had been exposed, but not destroyed, and sometimes exposure is not enough. The fire that consumed the ridge cabin was only the beginning. When the smoke cleared and the embers cooled, there were no bodies. No Eleanor, no Matthew, no Isaac, only ashes, scattered bones that could not be named, and blackened beams that groaned as they collapsed. For the settlement, that absence was more terrifying than discovery. If the family had died in the blaze, it would have been an ending. But with no bodies, there could be no closure. The posse fanned out through the woods, torches flickering, rifles at the ready. They followed tracks through the frost, trails that split and vanished among the rocks. Dogs were brought in, noses to the ground, but the scent twisted and broke in the cold air. For days the search continued, men combing the ridgeline, shouting into the silence, listening for any sound that might betray the family's flight. What they found instead were signs that chilled them more than footsteps. In one clearing, a half-burned cloak. In another, a scatter of bones, too cleanly cut to have been left by wolves. Near a creek bed, the remnants of a campfire, its ashes warm, its stones streaked with fat. The ridges were moving, but they were still feeding. Every mile of ground covered seemed only to prove that the family had not fled in panic. They were traveling with purpose, with patience, with the same method that had made their hearth a trap. Whispers spread quickly. Some said the ridges had split apart, each carrying the family's trade into different valleys, starting new cabins where no one knew their name. Others swore they had stayed together, shadows moving through the forest as one, striking at night, vanishing before dawn. A few claimed the family had joined with other outcasts, building an entire camp hidden deep in the wilderness, where the fires never went out and the stew pot never emptied. The settlement's fear grew with each rumor. Farmers refused to travel alone. Peddlers armed themselves or avoided the valley altogether. Children were warned not to stray near the ridgeline, their parents whispering that the smoke from a chimney might not mean safety. And when hunters vanished in the following months, when their packs were found but their bodies never recovered, people knew where to place their fear. The ridges are still out there. The ministers tried to calm the town. They preached that God had punished the family, that the fire was judgment enough, that to speak their name was to invite their spirit. But silence never stopped stories. In taverns, men swore they had seen figures moving in the tree line, watching, waiting. A hunter told of hearing laughter in the night, low and cruel, carrying across the frozen creek. A woman claimed she had seen Eleanor herself, standing at the edge of the orchard ruins, her face pale, her eyes burning with firelight. The manhunt dwindled, as all manhunts do. Winter deepened, snow fell heavy, and the settlement could not spare men to wander endlessly through the woods. The ridges had slipped away, whether into graves unmarked or into shadows unbroken, and the posse returned with nothing but fear. The cabin ruins were left to rot, a scar on the land, the orchard trees blackened by fire, the soil beneath them poisoned with whispers. In the years that followed, the legend of the Ridge family grew larger than the facts. Travelers told of cabins that appeared where no settlement had ever stood, smoke rising but no sound within. Hunters claimed to stumble on hearths still warm, though no footprints marked the snow. Some said the family had taken to disguises, appearing as ordinary settlers, only revealing themselves when the door was bolted and the fire burned high. Others claimed the family never aged, that hunger preserved them, that they wandered eternally, luring strangers into their endless feast. What terrified the settlement most was not the memory of what had happened, but the possibility of what might still be happening. A family exposed, but never captured, a crime revealed, but never ended. Each disappearance, each rumor, each traveler who failed to arrive at their destination gave the legend new breath, and the legend was enough. To this day, the ruins of the Ridge cabin are avoided. Locals swear the soil is cursed, that no grass grows where the hearth once stood. Children dare each other to stand among the blackened stones at night, to call the family's name, to see if smoke rises again. Some return laughing, some return pale and silent. A few do not return at all. The ridges disappeared into the wilderness, but the wilderness has a way of giving back echoes. The law never found them, the settlement never buried them. Their story remained unfinished, and unfinished stories never die. The Ridge family may have vanished into the woods, but their story did not. It clung to the settlement like smoke to cloth, refusing to wash out, no matter how hard ministers or elders tried to scrub it away. Their hearth was gone, their cabin blackened, but their name lingered in every whispered warning. At first, the story traveled only along the valley. Neighbors told neighbors to beware the ridgeline, to trust no stranger's fire. Hunters pointed toward the ruins and muttered about bones still buried under the orchard soil. Children grew up hearing the same refrain, "Never follow smoke on the ridge." It became a proverb, a chant passed between generations, its meaning clear even to those too young to remember the night of fire. But whispers have a way of traveling faster than feet. Peddlers carried the tale to distant towns, each retelling adding new shadows. In some versions, the ridges salted their victims' flesh in barrels, storing it for lean winters. In others, they wrote recipes in a hidden journal, using scripture twisted into instructions for slaughter. Some swore Eleanor herself had prayed over the bodies, thanking God not for the lives of her family, but for the meat of her guests. Each retelling added another layer, and soon the Ridge family were no longer just killers. They were symbols of the frontier's darkest fear, that safety itself could be a trap. The law tried to contain it. Records grew vague. Reports spoke only of unresolved deaths, of missing travelers, of a family, believed perished in fire. Officials dismissed the stories as superstition, claiming wolves and storms explained the disappearances. But the people knew better. Wolves did not cook their prey in hearths. Storms did not scatter bones in orchards. Wolves and storms could be survived. The ridges were something else entirely. What made the story powerful was not just what the family had done, but what had never been answered. Were they dead, buried in unmarked graves, their bones indistinguishable from the ashes of their cabin? Or had they survived, slipping into other valleys, building other fires, wearing other names? The uncertainty was worse than any certainty. Death ends a story. Disappearance keeps it alive. And so the Ridges became more than a family. They became a shadow that followed settlers as they pushed deeper into the frontier. Wherever a traveler vanished, the Ridges were blamed. Whenever a stranger offered warmth too freely, suspicions rose. Hunters spoke of finding cabins deep in the woods, doors unbarred, tables set, fires burning, but no one inside. They would back away slowly, certain that to step through those doors was to repeat the mistake of so many before them. Children played games with the story, daring one another to walk to the orchard ruins, to touch the blackened stones, to shout the family's name. Some laughed and ran back. Others swore they heard whispers in the wind or saw figures at the edge of the trees. A few claimed the hearth still glowed at night, faint and red, even though the cabin had been gone for decades. Parents scolded, but fear kept them from walking the ruins themselves. The legend grew as legends do, fed by silence, shaped by imagination, hardened by time. A family who once lived and killed became something larger, something half remembered, half invented. To some, they were cautionary, proof of what hunger and isolation could do to ordinary people. To others, they were monsters, demons in human skin, who had escaped judgment and wandered eternally, hearth to hearth, smoke to smoke. What made the Ridge family unforgettable was not scale, but intimacy. They did not strike on roads with pistols or in fields with ambushes. They struck at tables, with bowls of stew steaming, with doors locked, with firelight flickering across smiling faces. They turned the most sacred space, the hearth, into a weapon. And that betrayal was something no settlement could shake. Generations passed, but the fear did not fade. Even now, hikers in those hills swear they've seen smoke where no cabin stands. Hunters tell of stumbling on ruins where fires still smolder, though no footprints mark the ground. Locals say the orchard soil remains rich but barren, as though it refuses to grow anything but silence. And when strangers disappear, as strangers sometimes still do, the old words rise again. The Ridges are still out there. Perhaps they are gone, their bones long rotted, their names fading into dust. But perhaps survival taught them to move, to change, to lure anew. Perhaps somewhere on some forgotten ridge, a fire burns tonight, and a voice as soft as Eleanor's calls to a traveler, "Come in, warm yourself. Supper is waiting." It is the uncertainty that endures. The ridges remind us that the hearth we trust most can hide the knife, that the smile across the table may be the last face we see, and that sometimes the deadliest monsters wear the plainest faces. The Ridge family's story is not one of scale, but of intimacy. They did not slaughter armies, did not terrorize cities, did not carve their names into history with banners and battles. They invited the weary in from the cold. They offered bowls of stew, bread warm from the oven, a bed to rest tired bones. And then, when trust was given, they turned it into a weapon, sharper than any blade. That betrayal is what lingers. The wilderness has always been cruel. Men expect storms, wolves, hunger. They know the risks of traveling roads alone, but to be undone not by the wild, but by the hearth. To die not outside in the dark, but inside where the fire glows, that is a cruelty deeper than any natural fate. The Ridges understood this. They built their survival on it. What remains is not just the memory of those who vanished, but the question left behind. Were the Ridges destroyed in the fire, their bones lost among the ashes? Or did they escape, slipping into new valleys, new towns, new names? The absence of bodies leaves the door forever open, and open doors invite stories. That is why their legend endures. Not because of what is certain, but because of what is not. The orchard that will not grow, the stones that still bear blackened stains, the chimney smoke seen by hunters where no cabin stands. Each fragment renews the fear that the family did not end, that their hearth may still be waiting somewhere, its fire crackling, its door unlocked. It is tempting to call them monsters, to place them outside humanity, to reassure ourselves that no ordinary person could do such things. But they were not born different. They were not beasts. They were a family, a mother, a father, a son. They wore plain clothes, prayed in the same pews, plowed the same thin soil as their neighbors. The horror is not that they were unlike us. The horror is that they were exactly like us until they chose otherwise. Every retelling of their story carries a mirror. When hunger comes, when desperation claws, when survival presses against conscience, what would you do? Would you cling to dignity, to law, to faith? Or would you feed the fire one more time, even if the fuel was human trust? The Ridges answered that question with knives and bolts and smoke. Their answer is written in bones, in ashes, in whispers that never die. So when you next walk a lonely road, when the night is cold and your strength is thin, and you see a glow of firelight ahead, remember it. Safety is not always safety. A hearth is not always salvation. Sometimes the greatest danger waits where you feel most secure, and sometimes the deadliest welcome comes with a smile. The Ridge family lured strangers into their hearth, and their fire still burns in the shadows of history. If this story unsettled you, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and how late it is where you are. These journeys into the darker corners of history stretch farther when we take them together. And if you want to hear more stories like this, forgotten crimes, haunted families, legends that refuse to die, make sure you subscribe. There are more shadows waiting and more fires that were never meant to keep you warm because the ridges are gone. Or maybe they aren't. And that question is, what keeps the fire alive?